It is January 30th, 2026, and if you are new to this channel, welcome. If you've come back, then you know it is about to get interesting. You've seen the headlines, historic winter storm paralyzes the US. You've seen the satellite images, an atmospheric monster stretching from the Rockies to the Atlantic, swallowing entire states in a swirl of white and blue. But what you haven't seen, what you haven't been told, is that this storm just did something no one expected. It changed direction. Not a wobble, not a minor shift. A full-scale, model-busting, infrastructure-threatening pivot that has left meteorologists scrambling, emergency managers panicking, and millions of Americans suddenly in the crosshairs. Tonight, I'm going to show you what really happened, why it happened, and what the official reports are leaving out. If you think you know the story, think again. Let's start with the basics. The storm that just swept across the United States wasn't just a big one. It was a convergence of rare atmospheric events, a perfect storm in the truest sense. Meteorologists called it a super Arctic blast, but that phrase doesn't do justice to what actually unfolded. This was a storm that broke the rules, where cold, moisture, and terrain combined to create a disaster that was as much about ice as it was about snow. And the most sinister part? The models saw it coming, but the warnings didn't capture the scale. The public was told to expect snow, maybe some ice, but not the kind of entombment that would leave millions without power, hundreds stranded, and entire regions immobilized for days. But then, just as the first wave of the storm was supposed to move out, the system did something no one expected. It stalled, it pivoted, it reloaded, and it changed direction. The result? A second, even more dangerous wave, targeting areas that thought they were in the clear. So what really happened? And why are the details being glossed over in the official narrative? This wasn't just a storm front moving through. It was a collapse of the atmospheric system over North America. Here's what the official reports won't tell you. The models that forecasters rely on, the European, the American, the high-resolution rapid refresh, weren't converging as the storm approached. They were diverging. Normally, as a storm gets closer, the models start to agree. The cone of uncertainty narrows. But this time, the closer we got, the more the models disagreed. That's a red flag. It means the atmosphere was in a sensitive, unstable state, one where tiny differences in initial conditions could lead to wildly different outcomes. And that's exactly what happened. The storm didn't just bring snow, it brought a combination of freezing rain, sleet, and ice that the models struggled to predict. The result? A storm that was more persistent, more damaging, and more unpredictable than anything we've seen in decades. But the real shock came when the storm, instead of moving out as forecast, stalled over the Midwest, then pivoted and began moving southeast, targeting the Ohio Valley, the Appalachians, and the Southeast with a second wave of ice and snow. Let's talk about ice, because while everyone was focused on snow totals, the real threat was the ice. Freezing rain is the silent killer of winter storms. It looks like rain, but it coats everything in a layer of solid ice. Roads become skating rinks. Power lines snap under the weight. Trees fall, blocking roads and taking out whatever's underneath. And this storm delivered ice in quantities that most regions simply aren't built to handle. In Kentucky, for example, ice accretion reached up to 0.8 inches in some areas. That's enough to bring down power lines, collapse roofs, and make travel impossible. But here's what the official reports won't tell you. The models underestimated the ice. They predicted snow, maybe some sleet, but not the kind of prolonged freezing rain that actually occurred. Why? Because the atmospheric profile was outside the range of what the models were trained on. The combination of a warm layer aloft and a stubborn cold dome at the surface created perfect conditions for freezing rain, conditions that the models didn't fully capture. The result was a disaster that unfolded in slow motion. Roads that looked wet were actually coated in invisible ice. People went about their business until it was too late. And by then, the damage was done. And then, just as the first wave of ice was supposed to end, the storm reloaded and sent a second wave, this time targeting areas that had already been hit, compounding the damage and making recovery even harder. The power grid is designed to handle normal winter weather. It's not designed for a storm like this. As the ice accumulated, power lines sagged and snapped, transformers blew, substations went offline, and because the roads were impassable, repair crews couldn't reach the damage. The result? Over 1 million people without power at the peak of the storm. Some for hours, some for days. But here's what you're not being told. The grid didn't just fail in one place. It failed in a cascade. When one line goes down, the load shifts to neighboring lines. Those lines, already stressed by the ice, become overloaded and fail. The failure propagates through the system, taking down entire regions. And because the storm was so widespread, there weren't enough crews to go around. Utilities had to prioritize critical infrastructure, hospitals, water treatment plants, leaving residential areas in the dark. This is the kind of systemic failure that emergency planners have warned about for years. But until now, it was just a scenario. Now, it's reality. And the second wave of the storm, the one that came after the system changed direction, hit an already weakened grid, turning a bad situation into a full-blown crisis. The official death toll from the storm is still being tallied, but we know that at least 106 people lost their lives. Some died in car accidents on icy roads. Some died from carbon monoxide poisoning as they tried to heat their homes with generators or stoves. Some died from hypothermia, trapped in homes without heat. But the real human cost goes beyond the numbers. It's the people who were stranded for days, unable to leave their homes. The elderly who couldn't get their medication. The families who ran out of food and water. And it's the psychological toll, the fear, the uncertainty, the sense of helplessness as the storm dragged on and the power stayed out. These are the stories that don't make the headlines, but they're the stories that matter. And for many, the second wave of the storm, the one that came after the system changed direction, was the breaking point. People who had survived the first round found themselves cut off, isolated, and desperate as the storm returned. The National Weather Service and NOAA did their best. They issued warnings days in advance. They flew reconnaissance missions. They pre-positioned aid, but the warnings didn't capture the scale of what was coming. Why? Because the models were blind to the specific combination of factors that made this storm so dangerous. The atmospheric river that fed the storm brought more moisture than expected. The cold dome at the surface was more persistent than predicted. The warm layer aloft was just thick enough to turn snow into freezing rain, but not thick enough to melt it completely. The result was a storm that defied expectations at every turn. And because the models didn't see it coming, the public didn't take it seriously. People stocked up for a snowstorm, not an ice siege. By the time the true nature of the storm became clear, it was too late to prepare. And when the storm changed direction, when the second wave hit, the warnings were even less effective. People who thought they were safe were caught off guard. Emergency managers were forced to improvise, and the response lagged behind the reality. America's infrastructure is built for the climate of the past, not the climate of today. Power lines in the South aren't designed to handle an inch of ice. Roads aren't treated for prolonged freezing rain. Emergency shelters aren't equipped for multi-day outages in sub-freezing temperatures. And the systems that are supposed to coordinate the response, utilities, emergency management, transportation, are fragmented and underfunded. The result is a patchwork response that leaves some areas over-prepared and others completely exposed. This isn't just a failure of planning, it's a failure of imagination. We've been warned for years that the climate is changing, that extreme events are becoming more common, that the old rules no longer apply. But we haven't adapted. We're still playing by the old playbook, and the atmosphere just changed the game. And when the storm changed direction, when the second wave hit, the weaknesses in the system were exposed for all to see. Here's the part that should really worry you. The storm isn't over, not really. The atmospheric pattern that produced this event is still in place. The cold pools over Canada are reloading. The jet stream is still contorted into a shape that funnels Arctic air southward. And the moisture feed from the Pacific and the Gulf is still active. This means that even as the current storm moves out, the stage is set for another round, and another, and another. This is the age of reloading systems, where the interval between storms is shorter than the recovery time. Infrastructure infrastructure that's already damaged doesn't have time to recover before the next hit. Power crews that are already exhausted don't have time to rest. Emergency supplies that have already been depleted don't have time to be replenished. This is how systems fail, not in one catastrophic event, but in a series of blows that accumulate until the system can't recover. And that's exactly what we're seeing now. The storm changed direction, it reloaded, and it's not done yet. Let's talk about the models. Because if you want to understand why the warnings fell short, you need to understand how the models work and why they failed. Weather models are mathematical representations of the atmosphere. They take in data from satellites, weather balloons, ground stations, and use physics equations to predict what will happen next. But models are only as good as the data they're trained on, and this storm operated outside the range of historical analogs. The combination of a fragmented polar vortex, an atmospheric river, and persistent cold air damming created a scenario that the models weren't built to handle. The result was a forecast that underestimated the duration, the intensity, and the geographic extent of the storm. And because the models didn't see it coming, the warnings were too conservative. The public was told to expect a big storm, but not a historic one. By the time the models caught up, the storm was already underway, and when the storm changed direction, the models were even less reliable. The system was operating outside the range of their training, and the forecast became little more than educated guesses. When the warnings are vague, people don't prepare. When the warnings are dire, people panic. This storm saw both. In some areas, people ignored the warnings, assuming it would be just another winter event. In others, people rushed to the stores, clearing shelves of food, water, and batteries. But the real cost of uncertainty is in the response. Emergency managers have to make decisions with incomplete information. Utilities have to allocate resources without knowing where the worst damage will be. And when the storm doesn't behave as expected, the response lags behind the reality. This is the cost of model blindness. It's not just a forecasting problem, it's a human problem. And when the storm changed direction, when the second wave hit, the uncertainty multiplied. People who thought they were safe were suddenly at risk. Emergency managers were forced to improvise, and the response lagged behind the reality. The storm has passed, but the recovery is just beginning. Power crews are working around the clock to restore service. Emergency shelters are still full. Roads are still impassable in many areas, and the next storm is already on the horizon. This is the new normal, not a single catastrophic event, but a series of blows that test the limits of our infrastructure, our planning, and our resilience. The question isn't whether we'll see another storm like this. The question is whether we'll be ready when it comes, because the atmosphere isn't going back to the way it was. The patterns that produced this storm are still in place. The risks are still real, and the next event could be even worse. So what are the lessons from this historic storm? First, we need to recognize that the climate is changing. The old rules no longer apply. We need to build infrastructure that can handle the new extremes. Second, we need to improve our forecasting. That means investing in better models, better data, and better communication. Third, we need to prepare for reloading systems. That means building redundancy into our infrastructure, stockpiling emergency supplies, and training for multi-event scenarios. Fourth, we need to communicate risk honestly. That means telling the public when the models are uncertain, when the risks are high, and when the situation is outside the range of normal experience. And finally, we need to remember that resilience isn't just about infrastructure, it's about people. It's about communities coming together, helping each other, and adapting to a world where the only constant is change. What they're not telling you about the historic storm that just hit the US is that this wasn't just a weather event. It was a warning that our systems are vulnerable, a warning that our models are blind to the new extremes, a warning that the atmosphere is changing faster than we are. But it's also a call to action, a call to adapt, to prepare, to build resilience for the storms to come. Because this isn't the last historic storm we'll see, it's just the beginning. And the next one might be even worse. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay informed, and stay prepared.